Okay, having just done my Rush albums tier list, I think it's only natural that I do my second favorite band's album tier list, Dream Theater. We're gonna start with When Dream and Day Unite. This album is pretty rough around the edges, both in terms of production and songwriting quality. It doesn't sound too good. Well, like it sounds fine, I guess. It just kind of sounds like every other uh heavy metal album from the 80s. It has like that tinny production sound, and I don't think a lot of the tracks on this album are very strong. Or it might just be because I'm not a huge fan of like 80s Queensryche style metal, but um like I don't find myself revisiting material from this album very much. And Charlie Dominici is the vocalist on this album. It's the only album where James LaBrie is not the vocalist or lead vocalist. And there's he sounds fine, I think. Like he has more of like a Journey or Kansas style singing voice, like a classic rock style singing voice, more suited to that than like 80s hair metal. And like on the Killing Hand, he goes for this high note, like I am the killing hand, and he does this like falsetto thing because it's a little out of his range and it just sounds bad. And uh, uh I don't know. I don't really like this album. I'm gonna plop it in the D tier. And just for the record, just so you know, the albums on this tier list are I'm gonna be grading on a curve because this is Dream Theater we're talking about, and I hold them to a higher standard. So like objectively, I think this album is pretty average. It objectively it's like a C tier, but again, because I hold Dream Theater to a higher standard, it's gonna get D tier. At least I can say the musicianship is very, very good, and you can tell these guys know how to play, and they have the potential to make better music than what's on this album. And thankfully, they did. The next album is Images and Words, and up to the S tier it goes. I used to not like this album as much when I was younger, but over the years it's really grown on me. And re-listening to it, it's just like every track is a banger. Even Surrounded, which is like the weakest song on the album, it's still like a 4 out of 5, and every other song's a 5 out of 5. Learning to Live, I think, is a little overlong. Like if I was writing it, I would cut out certain parts of it to make it a little shorter and a little more cohesive, but it's still a banger and it's still like a 4.5 out of 5 instead of a 5 out of 5. And just like every song, I can listen to the whole thing beginning to end. There's not a single skippable track, and every single guitar solo on this album is absolute fire, and it shows. I mean, don't get me wrong, when Dream and Day Unite, like John Petrucci played some crazy solos on it, but there wasn't anything as melodic and well thought out and as beautiful as what's on this album. And uh, frankly, I think this album is where Dream Theater peaked and it's all downhill from here. But, you know, it's Images and Words. It's hard to beat. Next up is Awake, and Awake I'm gonna put in the B tier. Um, I know there's a lot of fans of this album who really love it. I'm just not one of those people. You got 6 o'clock, which is kind of a weird opening track, kind of off the wall, even by Dream Theater standards. Um, Erotomania There are parts of it I like, but as a whole, I'm not a huge fan of the whole track. Um, the Mirror is just, it's heavy, but it's very repetitive, because a majority of that song is just that da 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 chugging on the low B string. Um, there's some good songs on here, some I don't know if anything's really skippable, but I don't know. It's hard to explain. Like, there's nothing on here that I would say like lives up to Images and Words, and I am putting it in B tier for now. And then we have Falling into Infinity, which is um I'm gonna put in the D tier, which again I'll reemphasize objectively, it's probably like a C tier album. Like overall, it's pretty average. There's some highs, there's some lows, and overall it averages out to an objective C tier, which for the Dream Theater's sake, I'm gonna bump down to D tier. And uh Derek Sherinian was the keyboardist on this album, and I think him joining the band really changed the style of songwriting here, because you listen to a lot of tracks on this album, especially like Trial of Tears and even certain parts of New Millennium and Lines in the Sand. Like, the tracks overall are spacier, more room to interpretation, more fusion inspired, like with longer jammy sections that don't feel as like meticulously crafted as stuff from the last two albums. And just, I don't know, I think this album's kind of a mess. Uh like Trial of Tears is like one of the least Dream Theater sounding songs ever. Again, because it's so jammy. And like Anna Lee, they were probably like, oh, the last two albums had a piano ballad on them. We got to have a piano ballad on here too. And I like the piano motif of the song, but as a whole, I don't like the song as much. And like, um, Burning My Soul and uh, Hell's Kitchen and Just Let Me Breathe, and a lot of these other tracks are just like, they're just meh, and I don't really care for them. And next we have Metropolis Part 2, Scenes from a Memory, the first album with Jordan Rudess on the keyboard, even though a lot of the compositions on this album were written when either Derek Sherinian or Kevin Moore were still in the band. And a lot of people would put this album as S tier. I don't think it's quite S tier, but I'll still put it in A tier. Uh, really great tracks, really great songwriting. Some of the instrumental sections I think could have been shortened or omitted entirely. The Dance of Eternity is uh, interesting, but not super fun to listen to, I don't think, even though there are some really cool parts in there. The Spirit Carries On is a track where I don't like the studio version of the song, but I much prefer live versions of it, like the Metropolis 2000 Live Scenes from New York live album. I love the live version of that song there, and that's the version I find myself listening to most. Yeah, overall, it's really good. Next, we have 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence, which is a big turning point for the band, because up to this point, Dream Theater's brand of prog metal was more fusion based and it was more 80s and 90s era prog metal, but this album is the first really like modern prog metal sounding album they made, where you listen to the opening title, the opening track, Glass Prison, and it sounds nothing like their previous work. It's just like super heavy and just pounds you in the face for 13 minutes. It's an exhausting track to listen to, but it's weirdly kind of exhausting in a good way. Um, but after that, I don't think the album quite lives up to the hype. Um, like the Great Debate, I think is just overlong. I like Disappear, one of Dream Theater's more underrated tracks. Um, but then you have Disc 2, which is kind of Dream Theater's Fountain of Lamneth, where it you just have all these like the tracks that are thematically related, but they don't really mesh together as a single coherent 42-minute track. And it just works better as separate tracks. And even then, I think the tracks themselves aren't particularly strong. So, since there are a fair number of good tracks on this album, though, I'm going to put it in B tier. Next, we have Train of Thought, which is an intentionally one dimensional album, which I think is to the album's detriment because they were trying to just make this album heavy. We're going to make all heavy songs on this album. And it's just kind of dull to listen to for the most part. Like, As I Am is a pretty good song. In the Name of God is a pretty good album closer. The instrumental Stream of Consciousness is really underwhelming and a real missed opportunity. Definitely not one of Dream Theater's better instrumentals. And I just don't find myself revisiting tracks from this album very much. And I feel like James LaBrie's vocals don't really match the tone this album is going for, and I don't know. I'll put it C tier. Next, we have Octavarium, which the majority of the album I would say is more B tier, but just because of the title track alone, Octavarium, the closing track, that one track is so good. It might be the best song Dream Theater ever wrote, because a lot of Dream Theater's long songs, like their 20-minute songs, I find a lot of them could easily be trimmed down, but Octavarium is a song where I would not change one note. I think that song is perfect as is, and I wouldn't change anything about it. So, and just the way the whole track builds up and it climaxes in this awesome guitar solo that's one of John Petrucci's most underrated solos. And Jordan in the middle of the song has an awesome keyboard solo, one of his most underrated keyboard solos. And other than that, the rest of the album is pretty good. Like Panic Attack was a big song off this album. I Walk Beside You is kind of a weird change of pace for Dream Theater. Um, I don't know. Not every track grabs me, but overall, I'm gonna put this album in the A tier. And again, it's mostly just for that title track, bumping it up. And unfortunately, I think for the remainder of this video, the rest of these albums are not going to be as high. Because next we have Systematic Chaos, which to me marks the first album where Dream Theater was kind of going on autopilot, where things didn't really sound right. Like, and another thing I forgot to mention with Octavarium is starting around 2005 or so, you can tell Dream Theater was putting at least one track on every album moving forward, on every album that they hoped would have some kind of radio potential. And on this album, Forsaken is very clearly, obviously that song. And it's not necessarily a bad song, but it just sounds kind of like an Evanescence ripoff, and it just does not tickle my pickle. Um, and as far as the other tracks, Dark Eternal Night is pretty good. Repentance is overly long. Constant Motion, I think, is kind of not amazing. It's just like bleh. Ministry of Lost Souls and In the Presence of Enemies, parts one and two are, I don't know, they just don't do it for me. Like, it doesn't feel earned, like, it doesn't feel like the songs go anywhere. So I'm gonna put Systematic Chaos in C tier. Black Clouds and Silver Linings, the last studio album with Mike Portnoy on drums. Um, I am not a huge fan of this album. Again, with the radio hits, Wither is very obviously meant to be the song they were hoping would be their next Pull Me Under. And it sounds like a Three Doors Down song. Like, it really doesn't sound Dream Theater at all. Nightmare to Remember and The Best of Times, they have great moments, like The Best of Times outro solo obviously is like one of John Petrucci's most famous solos, but the rest of the song is just like forgettable. And Nightmare to Remember, I think, is just way too long. Like, it's got an epic opening and closing progression, but it's just way too long and it just meanders, I think. And The Count of Tuscany instrumentally is really great, but it's let down by the lyrics, which everyone says the Count of Tuscany lyrics are bad, and I agree. And I want to give Black Clouds and Silver Linings more than a C, but unfortunately, I don't think I can do it. I think I gotta give it a C. So Portnoy leaves, and then Mike Mangini comes, and honestly, I think Mike Mangini gets an unnecessary amount of hate. Like, yeah, he's not Portnoy, he doesn't hit as hard, but you know what? He's one of the best drummers in the world, and he's very eclectic, extremely technically gifted, and I do think he can bring energy to his drumming, and I think it's just the production that lets him down. Um, so, anyways, a dramatic turn of events. Um, I'm not a huge fan of a lot of tracks on this album. Like, Beneath the Surface is just kind of a lame uh, ballad. Bridges in the Sky is a weird track, and it's just kind of overlong. Lost, Not Forgotten, Build Me Up, Break Me Down, and On the Backs of Angels are okay. Like, there are highs there, but overall there's a lot of forgettable tracks. If it weren't for Breaking All Illusions, I would make this a C tier album. But Breaking All Illusions is one of Dream Theater's best songs. I love that song so much that it picks the whole album up from a C tier to a B tier. So into B tier, A Dramatic Turn of Events goes. And then we have Dream Theater's self-titled album, and why they decided to release a self-titled album now of all times, I have no idea. But I used to really not like this album. I used to think it was like D tier, but now my opinion on it has kind of softened. Um, like The Enemy Inside, The Looking Glass. Well, The Looking Glass, I'd say, is like objectively the best song on the album, and then you have The Enemy Inside, which is a pretty good song. Um, and then like the rest of the tracks I really don't like, and the instrumental Enigma Machine I don't think is that great. And then there's the epic at the end, Illumination Theory, which again I think it's a little overly long, but there's definitely a lot of great parts in that track, and the last 5 minutes of the song are really, really great. Where Dream Theater usually goes crazy with these long songs, but the last 5 minutes of the track, they just slow down. They have a simple chord progression, and there's nothing crazy technical about it except certain parts of the guitar solo at the end and maybe a couple drum fills here and there, but the way it all builds up to that final 5 minutes just really, really works for me. And I used to think this album was like a D tier album, but I think there's enough strong material on it, even though it's few and far between, to bump it up to C tier. Next, we have The Astonishing, which is an album I used to like more. I used to think it was more like a B tier album, but over time, now that I've listened to it several times over the course of the last few years, I'm thinking it's more C tier now. And the thing with The Astonishing, the frustrating thing about it is that it has really high highs and some really great stuff on there. And you got Dystopian Overture, which I love. You got The Gift of Music, which I love. And Lord Nefarious, which transitions into Savior in the Square, which transitions into When Your Time Has Come. I love that. And A New Beginning, great song, especially the outro guitar solo. And I love the closing track, Astonishing, which is just astonishing. Um, what really lets this album down for me is just its crushing length. It's 130 minutes. That's 2 hours, 10 minutes. That's not an album. That's like a full-on Broadway musical. And yeah, the musical style of this album is a little different from Dream Theater's usual repertoire. Like it sounds more big and orchestral. It almost even sounds like a Disney movie at certain points, but like, and there's great motifs, there's great song ideas, and there's certain tracks I really like I said before, but it's just way, way too long, and its crushing length destroys it, and that's why it's all the way down there in C tier. And also, the lyrics are really, really cheesy and dumb. Like, first of all, the plot is just 2112, and the lyrics are just so cheesy, and the character's name is Faith, and there's a track called Losing Faith. Haha, get it, guys? You get it? And the bad guy's name is Nefarious, and I'm like, oh, come on. And another thing that's really annoying about this album was just uh the excessive promotion around the time it came out. Look up Dream Theater interviews and videos from around 2016, 2017, even like when they were touring The Astonishing, which first of all, the live show, they just performed the whole album in its entirety and no other material from any other albums. And in interviews, they just talked about the album all the time, and they did so many interviews about it. And like you can tell, they thought it was like the greatest thing ever, especially John Petrucci and Jordan Rudess, who were like ecstatic talking about it. Like Mangini, Labrie, and Mayung didn't really talk about it as much. Like Labrie talked about singing on it, which he tried to be diverse, but like you can tell it's him the whole time. And just like I don't know, it's so much fatigue. We were just sick of that album by the time the touring cycle ended, and we were ready to move on. So Dream Theater responded to the excess with a fairly straightforward album, Distance Over Time, which is thankfully much shorter, only about 57 minutes, and uh kind of like Train of Thought, a lot of the tracks are heavy, and apparently they wrote it in 18 days, which is absolutely insane to me. um there's some pretty good songs on here, like Barstool Warrior, I think, is a good song. Pale Blue Dot is a pretty good song. um Untethered Angel is also pretty good. But other than that, I don't think the other tracks are really all that amazing. And there's no real super memorable stuff here. I don't think any of these songs are going to become live staples for them anytime soon. So I'm going to plop it in the C tier again. And finally, we have their most recent release, A View from the Top of the World, which I think is also C tier. Like, none of the tracks are really amazing to me. I'm just looking at the track listing right now, and like none of these songs I really want to re-listen to. The epic, even A View from the Top of the World, the title track is kind of a missed opportunity, I think, and it's just a little too repetitive, and I don't know, it didn't grab me really. And Awaken the Master was supposed to be the first eight string Dream Theater song, but it just kind of sounds like a down-tuned seven string guitar. Like, I don't feel like he really utilized the eighth string to its fullest potential. And to be fair, the eight string guitar is kind of a whole different animal. Like, to get the most out of it, you gotta play some crazy like Tosin Abasi or like Rob Scallon type stuff to get the most out of it. But yeah, overall, this album, there's nothing bad here, and I can say the same for Distance Over Time. There's nothing bad, but there's nothing like really that great. So yeah, and to C tier it goes. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Dream Theater's studio discography. Um, and again, all these albums are graded on a curve, or a reverse curve, I should say, just because Dream Theater are a band that love pushing themselves. Um, and most of their lower ranked albums that I put in like C tier, more of their recent stuff is there just because uh, they feel like they found a sound and they're just kind of rolling with it. And they still sound like Dream Theater, unlike what I was saying about Rush at the end of that video. But Dream Theater, I feel like they still got it in them to make another Images and Words, or even another Scene from a Memory. Um, I think they're absolutely incredible musicians, and their quality of songwriting is also top notch when they're on their A game. And I just think uh, no one else can really touch them. There's only one Dream Theater, and that's all there's ever going to be. Like there's sound-alike bands, kind of like Symphony X, but they're just not as good. Um, so yeah, those are my thoughts on Dream Theater. If you strongly disagree with any of my opinions, feel free to let me know in the comments.